when Jesus prayed, he prayed there'd be one in us. Now, we always say one with each other. Well, that's true, but the oneness comes in a relationship to the Father and the Son. It's like 1 John, where John says, truly our koinonia fellowship is with the Father and with the Son. If we walk in the light as he is in the light, we'll have that same koinonia fellowship one with another. And that's what we saw. We saw first there was a koinonia love relationship with God. But that was an automatic bonding of our lives with the same kind of fellowship. You can't have one kind of fellowship with God and another with your brother.
Yeah. You know, the deepest relationships that I have in life are people I prayed with. Because if you truly pray, I mean truly pray, your heart's out there on the altar.
Especially if God initiates that.
And so when that happens, you know, there's a bonding that takes place in the Spirit that you can't have just through having fellowship like this.
Yeah.
You know, and this is wonderful, you know, just to share our hearts with each other. But when you really go before the Lord and God has done a work, you know, there's something that's
and to catch that bigger picture, and much of comes when you look back and see what God has done. That it all looks so very ordinary at the beginning. It is normal for pastors to suddenly sense we need to be praying together.
Yeah.
But no flash in the sky or nothing like that. Just, I'm watching to see whether your hearts will bond with me. Because if I bring a movement, God would say, if I bring a movement in your city, there's got to be a bonding from the spiritual leadership. I just want to see what you're going to do. And if you match what I require when I bring my presence, then I will bring my presence. I hear people say, well, revival is the sovereign work of God. And I'd say that's true. But you forget, God has sovereign conditions.
Yes, yes.
And we do have a role to play in our relationship to God. When our hearts are bonded with him and one another, then there's the condition that exists now that God can come and trust us with what he's about to do.
And that great promise from 1 John chapter 5 that says, and anything you ask according to my will, we know that he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, we know that we have the petitions we've desired him. That's not a formula. The will of God is what's in the heart of God. I mean, what he is passionate about.
But he initiates.
That's right. And when we line up with what's in his heart, when our hearts come under his heart and there's that unity of that, then we can ask whatever we will. And it's not a formula. It's a present spiritual reality.
Yeah, and I think in that regard, Sammy, we get it backwards. We want to tell God we want him to bring revival. And usually he doesn't. But if God's the one who's initiating a heart cry for revival that you had not intended to pray, then he's announcing to you in what he's initiating in you to pray. He's announcing to you what he's about to do. If God is the initiator, then you're being caught up in the middle of the will of God. And whatever you ask out of that context, it'll be done. He's already purposed to do it. But we sometimes dream up what we want God to do for us. And then we keep praying and praying, and God doesn't seem to pay any attention. He didn't initiate it.
I'm going to kind of take maybe a turn here on something I want to ask you about. Most people who are probably listening to this have read your book, Experiencing God. You know, the Lord has used that piece in a mighty way. Tell me how that book relates to your view of revival, your passion for revival. How was that born in relationship to revival? Give me a little background on that.
Well, Experiencing God, the material, is my life message. That's how I've lived all my life. And I did not initiate writing the book. Someone was hearing me bear witness to how I've always lived with God. And it was so different from what they were hearing We were not talking about knowing God, we were talking about experiencing God. But that's how I've lived all my life. That's how I pastored, what you see there. It is not something that came afterwards. That's what I was and am to this day. Someone hearing that said, have you ever put that into writing? And I said, no. And they said, well, would you be willing to put it into some material that others could study, because you have a unique way of understanding and knowing and doing the will of God, because the subtitle is Knowing and Doing the Will of God. And I believe that God has a DNA in every believer, that he wants to know and do the will of God. They just don't know how to go about it. So I said, well, I've never written before. And my first book that I wrote was this one at 55.
That's encouraging.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Penny went out there, if you are along in the way, though I was an English major, I had resisted writing. And I said, I don't know how to write. And they said, well, we'll put an editor with you, which was Claude King. So I came to Claude and I said, Claude, I wonder if there's a way that we can write this so it isn't just another course. But in the study of this, it will become a real experience with God. He said, nobody's ever asked me that. So we enlisted 30 people who were great prayers. They had one assignment: pray that God will show us how to write this so that when people go to study it, it will become one of the deepest experiences with God they've ever known. From that day to this, whenever I speak, some people want to come and say a word to me, and I can always tell the one whose lives have been changed, back 4 or 5, they're crying. By the time they come up to talk to me, they'll say, I thought this was just another course, but it became the deepest experience with God I've ever known. And I'll say, that's what we prayed it would become. So it is my life message. And of course, any experience with God is my definition of revival. Revive means what used to be. In the full presence of the life of God, you've drifted. Now you need to return. And if you return to him, God's people, then he'll return to you. And revival is the return of the full life of God in the life of the believer, and then in the life of the corporate life of the believer, in the life of the churches.
You know, so much you've said there, and I want to ask you about, I don't know if we'll have time here, but there's so much. But this whole thing of the life message, you know, God works in each of our lives. His work, he's the same. We come from different perspectives, different backgrounds, and he works into us. And there's normally something specific that he works in our lives that becomes our life message.